Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts bless your name. Amen. Amen. So there are a couple places you could go right now in Livermore, and I'm sure in surrounding areas as well, but I know of these places, where you could see the power of water to literally change the earth. You probably remember last year around New Year's when it rained, and it rained, and it rained, and it rained, and the arroyos in the area just kept rising. When it first started, I actually took our girls down to the arroyo, and while it was raining, they played in the rain and actually in the arroyo, and we had all kinds of fun, got great pictures. But within a day of playing in the arroyo, the water was no longer slow moving. And as it kept rising and kept getting faster and faster, it kept getting more and more dangerous as well. And there was one night when the water had filled some of the designated overflow areas that some of the local water management people had created. And it was beginning to threaten to spill up and over the banks, flooding neighborhoods. There were places where it was even coming up as high as and near to the bridges. And it didn't quite get there, but it still made it really high. And there was a growing anxiety and a bit of a panic as people were wondering what is going to happen with this water. And you could just see the power of the water, unstoppable as it tore through, as it uprooted whole trees, as it dragged things along with it downstream. But it was most fascinating when the water went back down. And I went to some of the places where I normally go, and I could see the actual changes in the terrain. Right? The arroyo, which used to move this way, was now moving through a totally new channel this way. And there were these places where the bike paths that had followed right next to the arroyos were now totally gone, washed out. And in Sycamore Grove, you can actually right now go and you would see this place where park rangers had to physically reroute, create a new bike path through the park, through a section of the park, because the old path is gone. But not only did the old path get washed out, but the water, it actually now flows continuously right through where that bike path had been. And so they had to create this entirely new route for bikes around the water. How often are we trying to get around water because water goes where it wants? On a really small scale, these land changes caused by heavy rain, it gives us this entry point into our passage. Verses 2 and 3 poetically describe the earth-giving way. Verses 2 and 3, we read, "The mountains be moved into the heart of the sea. Its waters roar and foam. The mountains tremble at its swelling." And on one hand, right, this is obviously a metaphor. The psalmist will later make some very practical connections for us. And we'll get there in a few minutes. But for now, I just want us to understand what the Bible is doing with these words and images. The earth gives way. The sea, though its waters roar and foam. The very first time we encounter these two realities, earth and sea, is in the creation story. Genesis 1, verse 9. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. God called the dry land earth, and God called the waters that he gathered together seas. And this story shows us what God is doing to make a space for us to live. He takes the waters and he gathers them up so that there then is this space, this land called earth. And he's now created these two distinct domains, earth and seas. And the relationship between them is fascinating. The Bible will go on to describe God as the one who gives the waters its boundaries. God is the one who holds back the waters and keeps them continually from recovering or reclaiming the earth. If you could picture a dam, the way that a dam holds back waters and keeps it from flowing forward. This is what God is doing with these waters at all times. And the reason that God does this is he wants to create a space that is hospitable for human life. The earth is the place that God made for his image bearers, us, right? To live and to work and to walk with him. And so he pulls back the waters, gathering them into the seas. And God looks at this separation. He sees the potential for life that now that the waters are under control. And God looks at this and he calls it good. And it would be really easy for us to hear this and sort of superficially assume, okay, well, that means earth is the place where humans live, so that's good, and the waters are bad. Except Genesis 2 will tell us that for the earth to produce life, for earth to sustain us, it needs some sort of water. We know this. It's kind of one of those duh things. But the earth needs the water in a controlled way. And this makes like real sense to us when we think about our own yards and landscaping, our gardens, and our sprinkler systems designed to, in a controlled way, nourish some small piece of land, of earth. Genesis 2 tells us that God waters the earth with a sort of mist, and that there's enough of this mist that the extra water gathers together into rivers and it runs back into the sea. And this mist and the rivers together, they water the earth and they produce beautiful and flourishing gardens like the Garden of Eden that we come across in the early chapters of Genesis. It is watered by this kind of river. And all of this then paints this picture for us of a well-ordered world, right? A good world. A good world that's governed by a good God who holds back the bulk of the dangerous waters that would consume us. And instead, God releases just enough for life. But this good story quickly turns. God's image bearers quickly began to take control over God's world. And so what God meant for good, humans began to steal. They began to kill for. They began to destroy the very good things that God made. Human beings are destroying every good gift that God has given. And the violence of humanity is truly horrific by the time we get to Genesis chapter 6. Only 6 chapters have unfolded. And so that by chapter 7, God, completely brokenhearted, decides to stop holding back the waters. And the Bible tells us that once the waters are released and they cover the whole earth, This is where we get our first mention of mountains in the Bible. The story wants us to know the water so profoundly covers the earth that it covers the mountains. The earth is flooded completely. And what did Psalm 46 say? The earth gives way. The mountains moved into the heart of the sea. Can you hear it? The psalmist is using language from the flood, from Genesis, to describe this situation. Though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swell. Can you picture the water? Maybe you've had an experience with aggressive water. Hurricanes, floods, other sorts of instances where you know that water is way more powerful than you. Aggressive, powerful, roaring, foaming, it rises. And can you picture this poetic image of mountains, mighty mountains, trembling? It's a cool picture. The mountains are afraid. Like they are shaking as the water inches up. As mighty as they are, they know that they'll never be the same when they've been covered by water because of the power of water. They don't stand a chance against the waters. And the higher the water rises, the more they tremble until finally the earth just gives way and is gone. Right? The mountains are in the heart of the sea. Everything is underwater. Everything except, in the flood story, what's not underwater? 8 human survivors and a group of animals. They make it out alive in an ark. Notice what the psalmist says: God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. In the language of the flood, God is his ark. God is his help, his rescue in the face of the rising water. God is the boat. Which leads us to ask a practical question. The psalmist who writes this, Psalm 46, is he facing his own actual flood, like the great flood from Genesis? Is he sitting somewhere watching waters rise and shaking? Is water currently rising around him? Or is the psalmist using flood imagery? Is he drawing on the experience of this story to describe something else entirely? And the answer to this question comes just a few verses later. In verse 6, we hear this: the nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. I'm going to read this from a different translation. Nations roar, kingdoms crumble. God utters his voice, the earth melts. Not a major difference, right? Nations raging versus roaring, they both sound bad. Kingdoms tottering versus crumbling, like the end is coming for both, right? I mean, so not a big difference. The difference between the two is that the CEB, our congregation Bibles, translate these words consistently through Psalm 46, whereas for some reason the ESV translates or uses different words. And so in the ESV, the mountains are moved, but the kingdoms totter. And the nations roar while the waters rage. But in the Hebrew text, the words are actually exactly the same. And these phrases are set to be read side by side. The mountains and the kingdoms in Psalm 46 are doing the exact same thing. The nations and the waters in Psalm 46 are doing the exact same thing. And the CEB helps us hear this, right? In the CEB, the mountains crumble and the kingdoms crumble. And so we see a parallel between them. And the nations roar and the waters roar. And so we hear a parallel between them. So with the CEB's help, we can hear the specific situation that the psalmist is comparing this great flood to. The psalmist isn't experiencing his own flood. No. Waters rising up and covering the earth is just like the psalmist's experience, or a lot like. And what he's experiencing is nations violently rising up in strength and violence. And if you think about Israel's experience, as you read the Bible, you will recognize stories just like this, right? There are these distinct moments where, like, for instance, a nation like Assyria, it grows and it grows in power and strength and in violence. And one by one, this nation consumes Israel's villages and cities, making its way to the capital city in Jerusalem, which is supposed to be the tallest mountain in the world. Right? This army, this invading army is like a roaring flood that seems unstoppable as it speeds up and as it rises. And can you just close your eyes with me for just a second? Can you imagine yourself on a hilltop and you're looking around in every direction and you see armed soldiers and they're marching towards you? And everything they pass, everything they come across, they consume or destroy. And you are in the middle and they are coming at you. That feels dire, right? Terrifying. The psalmist is connecting this experience with standing on a hill and watching the waters rise and rise and rise. And you know that it's coming where you will be consumed. If the waters are like warring nations, then what we realize is that the mountains are all of the various kingdoms. Not just Israel, but other kingdoms often get swallowed up by invading nations. And sometimes when the waters then recede, right, a kingdom might still be there, but often looks very different after that conquering nation has gone home. It has been reshaped by the waters. When you have been invaded and conquered, you do not remain unchanged. Like a mountain swallowed up by water. I want to make what might sound bold, a bold promise, but really isn't that much this morning. If you will spend any amount of time with this imagery, meditating on this imagery, and just starting to notice it throughout the Bible, this imagery of waters, its power, its roaring, raging nature, its consuming nature, if you'll pay attention to it, and then notice mountains, the way that they stand, the way that they fall, the Bible will start to come alive in some really exciting and fresh ways. So I just offer that to you as you're reading Psalms and the poets over the next however many weeks. But before we move forward, I want to do one thing. I want to connect the psalmist's experience with the warring nations and the crumbling kingdoms to our own world for a second, and point out some of the places where right now people are praying Psalm 46 in very, very equivalent, similar situations. And so consider the people of Ukraine over the last few years. And just imagine being a follower of Jesus in Ukraine praying this prayer, right? Can you just notice their hearts? Notice their minds. Imagine what they're feeling and experiencing during the very first attacks. As bombs begin to explode, as word starts to spread that an invading army has quickly begun to take over cities, places where you have family members. Can you imagine what you might go through, what they were going through during the initial invasion of Ukraine? Right? Reports everywhere immediately were saying Ukraine had little to no hope. They were about to be swallowed up. And wouldn't it feel like, just imagine every day you have your routines and your rhythms, you have your national holidays, you have all of your life is pretty secure and established. And then one day, it looks like it's all gonna go away. The world feels like it's falling apart in that place and in that moment. As outside invaders come and threaten to swallow up your whole way of life, your whole people. Like, wouldn't it feel like, isn't this perfect language? That a rushing flood, an unstoppable flood is roaring and foaming on its way to come and drown you. And yet, in the midst of it, you might resonate with this language and say, this is what it feels like, but what would it look like to trust like the psalmist, that God is your refuge and strength, to trust that God is present with you, that God is in the midst of you, no matter what is happening or what is coming at you, that no matter what happens, you shall not be moved, that Yahweh is with you, that your God, through this, on the other end of this, will be raised up above this and every invading nation. That Yahweh, the God who rules over the heavens, that God is actually here with you right now on the earth. This is the kind of trust the psalmist expresses. The threat of the waters is real. And in Israel's history, there are moments when God turns the waters back. And there are moments when God preserves his people as the waters consume the mountain. The threat of the water is real. But God is the one who can hold the waters back. And God is the one who can preserve you in an ark when he decides to let the waters go. That conviction, those convictions are what let the psalmist pray, Psalm 46. And sometimes we don't know whether God's going to hold the waters back or let them cover the earth. Drawing on the psalmist's direct experience, God's people for thousands of years have often prayed this psalm in the face of mighty, powerful empires doing their very worst. But what does a psalm like this mean for some of us who don't face the daily threat of an invading army? Well, this psalm hasn't been limited to just military battles between nations and kingdoms. It's really interesting because of the way that the image of the earth and seas work. God's people have actually found all sorts of ways, sorts of helpful analogies or connections through the centuries. And I want to name a couple of them. But consider, right, that God created boundaries, like the one between the earth and the seas. When those God-created boundaries are crossed, so that the violent chaos from one side consumes the life on the other. Anywhere we see this happening, we might find a connection to this psalm. That's what's happening, right? When one nation with clear borders crosses the border to attack its neighbors. But then consider other areas of our life, and this might seem like a stretch, and if it does, spend some time with it, meditating on it. But think about the language that we use when we talk about overwork or busyness. I just feel swamped. Oh, there's a good water image. I feel like I'm underwater. We talk about treading water or coming up for air. We use this image a lot when it comes to our work and our busyness. But we rarely would talk about our work as a violent enemy trying to consume us. Here's the thing. It's not supposed to be an enemy. God actually made us to do good work. Work that is life-giving for us and for the people around us. But work is only good within its God-given boundaries, right? We were made to work for 6 days. And then we stop. We choose on the seventh day to be still and know that I am God. Our nation's values of achievement, values of accumulation, don't really lend themselves to stopping. And they have this way of rising against us and trying to consume us as we try to consume more. But Sabbath, a word that literally just means to stop, is the practice that we're learning together in our neighborhood groups. And stopping is a refuge for us. A Sabbath is an ark in the midst of rising waters. It's a gift of God's presence and strength in the midst of the rat race to move higher and to gain more. It's a gift to help us not be consumed by the ever-rising demands of work and life and achievement. Another example. It shouldn't surprise us at all that addicts often talk about their addictions with language that resonates with Psalm 46, right? Like a mountain powerless against rising water, an addict knows that the addiction, like water, is stronger than they are. And it often rises high enough to swallow them up, to cause them to crumble. And this makes a lot of sense when we think about what's at the heart of a lot of addiction, disordered desire. When we think about just desire in general, right? God created us to desire. Desire is part of God's design, and yet God then comes along and puts limits on our desire. The first humans in the garden, God gave everything for food. He gave them a desire for it all, and he limited their desire by saying, hey, that one single tree in the center, don't touch it. It's not available for you. But seeing it and desiring it, they cross that boundary and they take it and eat it. They consume it. Because they couldn't live within God's limits, they couldn't get enough. And as the human story unfolds, we hear this story of unrestrained desire. Unrestrained desire sure sounds a lot like a roaring flood, like a consuming, rising water. People want more and more, and that leads to this, there's this question. Are our disordered desires like the waters trying to swallow us up, or are we actually like the waters, so driven by our desires that we are rising looking to swallow up and consume others. There's a lot of consuming happening. But that brings us to the end of the psalm. A strange line, one that you've heard multiple times now this morning. I want to close here. Be still and know that I am God. The reason I say it's a strange line, it's an interesting line, is because it's actually not obvious when you read the psalm who is being talked to. God is obviously the one speaking. Know that I am God. Be still. Well, but who is to be still? Is he talking to the violent conquering nation or the crumbling kingdom? Who needs to be still? Remember Jesus on a boat with some friends. To the wind and the waves, Jesus says, be still. And they obey because they know that he is God. But Jesus also actually looks at his disciples in the boat, these disciples who are anxiously freaking out about the dangerous water that looks like it's going to consume them. And he says, with different words, but basically the same thing, be still. Because they need to know that he is God. And so in this way, it seems to be a word for all. Be still if you are the waters. God's word of be still can hold back the waters. But also be still if you are threatened by the waters. Because God can preserve you through them. Often, for God's people, we find ourselves threatened by the waters. And we hear Jesus just as he is about to be consumed. Right? Jesus, he's at his dinner. His final dinner with his friends, and the waters of the Jewish and the Roman authorities are about to rise up and consume him. They are about to kill him, execute him, destroy him. And there at this table, he is still, and he looks at his friends and he says, John 14, let not your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust in me. Where are the waters rising against you this morning? Rising against us? What does it look like for us to come and find rest in Christ? A starting place. It's the table where we experience God as our refuge and strength, preserving us through death. Here at the table, we experience God as present in our trouble. Pastor Dave, if you and the team would come, let me remind us that God is in the midst of us right now. We will not be moved. No matter what rages against us, no matter what crumbles, even when our lives feel like they are falling apart. Jesus says, not even the gates of Hades will prevail against my kingdom. I am with you until the end of the age.